What's going on, guys, and welcome to today's video. And today we are out here in the garage getting Dad's Jeep ready, or a little more ready to go off-road. Now, we did take this off-road and my new JL off-road for the first time a few weekends ago, and everything went very well. This thing did really good. Other than it just being muddy and a super muddy, sloppy mess out there. We are getting ready to go to a new off-road park that we have never been to before. But the whole time we were out there, I could only really think of one thing as Dad was going up and down obstacles, and that was the fact that we do not have an engine skid plate on this thing yet. That's always one thing that I'm always kind of very nervous or concerned with, is getting a hole in your oil pan. Obviously, you've got the transmission pan right behind it. On my JL, we threw the ASFR, that engine transmission kind of belly pan piece on there, which does have a pretty decent cost involved with it. So I knew I wanted to get something on this thing, but again, went off-road, everything was great. I was recently watching a Matt's off-road recovery video where they picked a very bone stock JL Rubicon out of a crazy rock canyon because it just barely touched the steel engine oil pan, cracked or damaged the oil pan, it dumped its oil, and they were dead in their tracks. They had to call Matt's Off-Road Recovery. I'll even try to throw a little screenshot of the very seemingly little damage that oil pan had. Yes, it got hit with a rock, but it just immediately dumped all the oil out. So again, that caused me to go, oh yeah, I need to find something for this thing. So this was the most cost-effective skid plate option that I can find for the JL. This is the WESTIN engine skid plate. Now, this does not cover the transmission skid plate. JLs have a very kind of thin cross-member bar that's at least covering about midway on the transmission skid plate. So we've at least got something there, but this is going to basically fully cover the steel and lower aluminum portion of the engine skid plate. And again, that being a little more important than the transmission, because if you get a hole in your engine oil pan, you're going to dump all the oil, and if you're not watching or ready to be able to shut the key off, you're going to kill the engine. If you were to rip a hole in your transmission pan, it's going to dump all the fluid, of course, but it's just going to stop moving forward. You're not going to kill a transmission. It's just going to run out of fluid. The torque converter can't move fluid anymore. The front pump, it just doesn't really affect it as badly as if you were running out of engine oil and you didn't notice. So that's why we've got this. We're going to throw this thing on today. Now, this does have a known fitment issue that I knew about before buying this thing, looking at it on the JL forums. There is, on the earlier JLs, a stud, I guess, in place of this bolt back here. All the later ones have bolts, so we've got to add a little couple washers to take up some clearance, but I will show you guys once we were under there. But I was able to pick this thing up on eBay for around $100. So again, relatively cheap insurance, so you are not left stranded on the trail. So let's get under this thing and throw this on. Now, I will mention this is the 3.6 liter V6, so I do believe there were options for the 2-liter turbo guys, but again, this video is on the 3.6 in the JL or JT for that matter. So let's get under this thing and take a few bolts out and throw this on and get this a little more safe or protected for off-road. All right, guys, so here is everything that comes with the kit. We've got the main skid plate. We've got a front bracket here that bolts to the front oil pan bolts. And then we've got our instructions here. And there's actually a decent, just exploded view here of how the thing is actually going to bolt on. So that's about all you're going to need to look at there and be able to get this thing ending up bolted on here. So underneath, we can see coming off the front axle, we've got our just kind of very exposed engine oil pan. And like you guys hopefully were able to see on the Matt's off-road video, it was just one little small hit over here on that corner of the metal lower oil pan, and that was enough to call the whole day off. As we're moving back, you can see the transmission oil pan, and it is actually tucked a decent amount, a couple inches higher than our oil pan that hangs down lower. And on top of that, you've got your exhaust crossover and that cross member that are all lower hanging, obviously, than the transmission oil pan. So you're going to do a lot of noise hitting rocks and things before you get into that transmission pan, to kind of warn you. But the engine oil pan is kind of the issue up there with absolutely no protection. So moving all the way up front, you can see our three front oil pan bolts. Those are the bolts that are going to need to come out to then bolt on the engine skid plate bracket that will then bolt on to the larger skid plate. So these three front 15s are going to be the first that come out. And then moving further back, we've got the 15 millimeter bell housing bolts here, and those are also going to need to come out. It is also kind of makes it a little more roomy if you pull these 10 millimeter brackets off, or the bolts for these brackets for your transmission line, so you can kind of get a little more room when you are trying to fish these two bolts in and out. So our front three oil pan bolts, which if I didn't already correct on screen, are 13 millimeter, not 15 millimeter. Those are all going to come out. And then we've got longer supplied bolts that will hold our front mount bracket into place. So now that we've got the front bolts replaced, we've got the front bracket installed like so, we went ahead and tightened those up. Now that we've got our front bracket on, we are ready to start getting the main skid plate installed. And we've got, for the front here, we've got a couple of carriage bolts that are gonna go from the skid plate forward, so they can then go into our bracket up high. Now that we've at least got one of those front bolts in, we're able to get their provided longer bolt here in the back. So with our provided bolt started over here, and I've got both of the front bolts bolting the skid plate to their bracket. Here's where you guys can see the small gap between the skid plate and the engine. Now, on the early JLs, I believe this bolt here had a stud on it. They designed this when the JLs came out, so you would have slipped this over the studded bolt, put a nice washer and a nut, and everything would have been fine. Unfortunately, they have since done away with that bolt with the stud. So now you are left with this gap here. Most guys are just throwing a couple of washers between here and a longer bolt, and it being perfectly fine. So that's what we're doing here, is just throwing some washers. I will eventually get a slightly longer bolt, and then this thing will be just fine. So guys, as you are tightening everything up, there is a little bit of adjustment or play in the front bracket. There is like a ½ inch of movement, so you can get that skid plate slid up as far as possible, and you still aren't touching the oil pan. Everything still has clearance, there's gap and everything like that. So I would want that skid plate up as high as possible as you're tightening those down. We've got our back bolts tight, and now I'm gonna tighten up those front carriage bolts, which are a 13 millimeter nut. So guys, here is the finished install. We've got everything bolted down. We've got the rear bolts, and as you can see, we've got a few washers stacked behind, making up that gap where that original studded bolt would have been. And up front here, you can see our bracket bolted onto the engine oil pan bolts, and then our carriage bolts going through the skid plate into the bracket, and then we've got nuts, lock washers, and the flat washers there. But you can at least now see that we've got a fully protected engine oil pan. So as that front axle travels off of a large obstacle, rock, whatever, you aren't just going to immediately smash the oil pan. You've at least got a big heavy duty skid plate, at least preventing you from doing that. And like I said, as you move down along the back, you end up hitting exhaust or cross member typically before you're ever going to get into that transmission pan. Also, something worth mentioning here is the drain plug location. It definitely looks like you'll be able to get a tool socket on it, get it out. Like every other engine oil pan skid plate ever in the world, it's probably more than likely going to make a mess. It's going to end up on the skid plate. That's just how they all are. I've never seen one that is designed correctly that doesn't just dump oil everywhere. So this one will do the same, and it will work as a nice rust preventative for the skid plate. Like I said, every single one I've ever messed with at the shop, they all end up being on the skid plate. So this will be no different. So guys, hopefully this gives you a more inexpensive option on at least getting some protection for your engine oil pan. You can spend thousands and thousands of dollars on some of these full systems that go under the vehicle. And if you're not out crawling Moab every single weekend, something like this is absolutely going to protect you for making that wrong move off of a rock. At least you're not going to immediately hit the oil pan. You've got something there protecting the engine oil pan. So we're getting ready to go out and wheel this weekend, and hopefully we never ever touch our skid plates, or at least we hopefully never smash our skid plates. They're always there for protection, and you hope to not need to use them, but at least now if we do need them, it's at least got one, and we aren't having to drag this thing off the trail because we've dumped all the engine oil on the ground. So guys, look forward to a hopefully future video on us wheeling in a brand new location that we've never been before. So guys, thanks for coming out into the garage today and putting another cool part on one of the Jeeps. And as always guys, thanks for watching, and we'll catch you guys next time.